My grandparents took me to the Rainbow Room at the top of the GE building in Rockefeller Center when I was 4 years old. The dance floor was polished and gleaming. There were waiters in white dinner jackets and black tuxedo pants, and we ate duck for dinner, its tender flesh and deep gamey flavor a revelation. For dessert, a kindly waiter brought me a black and white cookie on a little china plate. Lest you think something as special as an evening at the Rainbow Room would be lost on a 4-year-old, don't worry. I'll never forget it. Though it may be hard to believe, however, that wasn't actually when I fell in love with New York, even if I was awfully charmed. The weekend I fell in love came along several years later. I was 9, and my father and I were visiting the city with my grandparents again. My Grandma Ann had grown up in Brooklyn, and my Grandpa Dave, one of 8 children, had grown up in the Bronx. They'd moved away from the city as a young married couple when my grandfather got a job at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and had settled in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia where they would go on to raise their sons and spend the rest of their lives. But they left their hearts in New York. The Philly suburbs were a pallid substitute for the big vibrant city they'd grown up in, and even after 50 years in Philadelphia, when asked where they were from, my grandparents always said, New York. Grandma and Grandpa surrounded themselves with other New Yorkers and often returned to Manhattan on day trips, taking a bus into town, where they'd catch an afternoon performance at the opera or go to a matinee at the theater. Afterward, they'd have an early bird dinner with their friends at an Italian restaurant in Queens with thick white tablecloths, Neapolitan waiters, and red-sauced pasta before heading back home again. One weekend in 1986, my father and I met them in Manhattan. We went to see Madame Butterfly at Lincoln Center, where I sat on my grandmother's lap as the long-haired, doomed lady in a kimono sang, and we rode across town in a yellow cab driven by a man with an old-time Brooklyn accent. We met old friends of theirs for lunch and walked up Fifth Avenue, the city pulsating, alive, around us. I gaped at everything. The masses of cabs, the looming buildings, the people, as colorful and wild as anything I'd ever seen. I loved the narrow streets of the East 20s and the glitter of the Plaza Hotel. We walked past vegetarian kosher Indian restaurants and power-suited, big-shouldered businesswomen on Fifth Avenue. And I fell hard and fast. I bought a canvas I Heart New York tote bag from a street vendor and came home bubbling, proclaiming it, and knowing it in my bones. One day, I'm going to move to New York. And so, 15 years later, I did. I left Paris and Berlin behind, along with all the confusion and sadness that lurked there, and I found myself a job at a publishing company in Rockefeller Center. I had a little desk outside the publisher's office, and I answered his phone, fending off agents and authors, took notes in meetings, went out to book parties with other assistants, and reveled in bagfuls of free galleys. I walked over the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, skin tingling, with a still glorious lower Manhattan in plain sight, and felt a smug pride when I learned to navigate the West Village without a map. I had a small room in an apartment with 2 girlfriends on the Upper West Side, just across from Zabar's and a few blocks from Central Park. My roommates worked in publishing too, and after work we'd watch old Meg Ryan movies set in the streets around our apartment. On weekends we stayed out late or threw dinner parties with borrowed chairs and Christmas lights strung up over the windows, and in winter we fought with our landlady about the heat. That first year in New York, I spent every day in a febrile state of joy, discovering the thrill of black and white movies on Sunday afternoons at Film Forum, having Bloody Marys in pint glasses for dinner at the Tile Bar in the East Village, shaking Bill Clinton's hand at a book party in Tribeca, taking buses all around town just so I could see each neighborhood all the way through, hearing the laconic subway conductor announce Times Square as the crossroads of the world every morning on the way to work, and seeing all my fellow passengers break out in a smile. I never felt alone in New York. None of the solitude that had so dogged me in Paris was anywhere to be found. Even on long, solitary walks in Central Park and on early morning cab rides home after a long night out with friends, I felt like I was surrounded by people in the best possible way. I never minded the crowds. After the heartbreak of leaving Max behind, it felt like New York was healing me.